Unit 6, Lesson 4, Table of Values and Graphing. So the goal of today's lesson is to teach you guys how to come up with a linear equation from a word problem. So we're going to get right into an example. So Bob is a salesman who is paid $600 a week plus 10% commission on all of his sales. Determine an equation that models this situation. So we know that equations are made up of variables and numbers. So the numbers are already in the question, but the variables are not. So it's always important that when you're creating an equation, you write what is called a let statement. And all these let statements are is they're just a sentence saying what your variables represent. So what are the two things we don't know from this question or that we are trying to figure out? So we don't know how much Bob is paid, and we don't know how many sales he's going to make. Those are what our variables are. So we need to make a sentence that tells us what the variables represent. Let X represent the total amount of sales, and then let Y represent the total amount that Bob is paid. Okay, so let's set up the equation. So because the amount of money that Bob is paid depends on how much sales he makes, it makes sense that the amount he is paid is Y, which is the dependent variable, and X is the independent variable, which is the number of sales. So the equation is Y equals, or the amount of money that Bob makes equals 10% of X. So what was X again? It was the total amount of sales that he makes, right? So Bob makes 10% of whatever he sells plus another $600 every week. Okay? So there's the equation that represents how much Bob is paid. So create a table of values that models how much Bob is paid based on if he makes this much in sales. So the way we fill out this table of values is we use our equation. So if we want to figure out, okay, in 1 week he makes $0 in sales. How much does he get paid for that week? All you do is you plug in 0 for X and solve, because remember, X represents the amount in sales. So let's try that. So Y equals 0.1 times the amount he makes in sales, so for this week it was 0, plus 600. Now we do the math. So Y equals, so 0.1 times 0 is 0, so we're just left with 600. So if Bob makes $0 in sales 1 week, he's paid $600 for that week. Let's see how much money he makes if he makes $1,000 in sales. So I'm going to now plug in $1,000 into the X spot. Okay, so 0.1 times 1,000 is 100, plus 600 is 700. So if he makes $1,000 in sales, he ends up making $700. Okay, please fill this out for the rest of the chart. So all you're doing is you're taking the X value one at a time and plugging it into the X spot in the equation to figure out how much Bob is paid. Okay, so I've filled out the rest of the table. So we now know the amount that Bob would be paid based on the appropriate amount in sales. Okay, so we now have to graph the relationship. So going back to our table of values, we need to ask ourselves, what are the points that we graph? Well, they're the X and the Y points. So the X and the Y. So this point that we would graph is 0 and 600. The X and the Y, so 1,000 and 700. The X and the Y. Okay, so those are all the points we have to graph. Okay, so I've listed all the points that we have to graph. Now we just have to set up our axes. We have to label them both. So I've labeled my axes, so now we have to plot the points. So 0 and 600, 1,000 and 700, 2,800, 3,900, 4,000 and 1,000, and 5,000 and 1,100. Okay, let's connect the dots. So one thing I want you to notice is that the amount of sales was on the x-axis. And the reason why is because we learned that the x-axis is always the independent variable, and the amount of sales is independent. Now Bob's pay is on the y-axis because the y-axis represents the dependent variable. And remember, Bob's pay depends on the amount of sales. Okay, so part D is calculate the slope using your table of values and the slope formula. So let's scroll back up to our table of values to calculate the slope. So remember, the slope formula is y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So basically what we need to do is we need to pick 2 points from our table of values, label them x1, y1, x2, y2, and then plug them into the equation. Because remember, a table of values is just a bunch of points, and we know how to calculate slope using 2 points. All we need is 2. So, the nice thing about this is it doesn't matter which 2 points I pick. I could pick the first ones, and you could pick the last 2, and we'd get the same answer. So, just to keep it easy, I'm going to pick the first 2 points. So I'm going to call this one x1, y1, this one x2, y2. Okay, now let's plug those values into our formula. So y2 is 700, minus y1 is 600, x2 is 1,000, x1 is 0. So it can be reduced to 1 over 10 or 0.1. So the slope of our graph below is 1 over 10 or 0.1. Alright, part E. If the salesperson had a weekly pay of 1,200, how many sales were done that week? So remember, our equation was y equals 0.1x plus 600. And remember, our variables were y represented Bob's weekly pay, and x represented the value of sales from that week. If we want to find how many sales were done that week, it means we're trying to find x. We're trying to figure out what is the value of sales. And we can use 1,200 to do that. So let's plug in 1,200 into our equation. So ask yourself, where does that go? Does it go into the y spot or does it go into the x spot? Well, what does 1,200 represent? It is apparently the weekly pay. So it has to go into the y spot because y represents weekly pay. So let's plug in 1,200 in for y. And then let's solve for x. Because if we solve for x, that will tell us how many sales were done that week, because x represents the number of sales done that week. Okay, so we need to get x by itself, so let's bring the 600 to the other side, and it'll turn into subtraction. Okay, and then let's simplify that, so 1,200 minus 600 is 600. Okay, now let's bring the 0.1 to the other side, and it turns into division. So we get 6,000 as our answer. So whenever you're asked a question in words, make sure you end your answer with words. So we have to write a therefore statement. So therefore, if the salesperson had a weekly pay of 1,200, there must have been $6,000 in sales.